تعالي بقى عيشي حياتك. هي دخلت
يا دكتور مروة تقعد هنا؟
اه
يلا يا دكتور. وانا
يلا يا ولاد تفضلوا.
اقعدي جنبي بس ممكن حضرتك تفكري الصورة قبل ما نفتح النت. تحبوا ادخلها هي يا دكتور؟
University. Today, our guest speaker is Professor Jenny Dubino. She's a professor of English, Global Studies, and Animal Studies at Appalachian State University, North Carolina, USA. She has been a visiting assistant professor of literature and women's studies at Bilkent University, Turkey, a Fulbright scholar researcher at Egerton University, Kenya, Fulbright specialist at Northeastern University, China, and visiting scholar at Ain Shams University, Egypt. She has taught courses in literature, cultural studies, writing and speech, women's studies, and animal studies. Her talk today is entitled, We Were Told of Disabilities, Disability Studies and Literature. I'm sure we are going to benefit a lot today and explore more about this interesting topic. We'll be happy to receive all your questions in the chat box after Professor Dubino's talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dubino.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's such a pleasure, even if I can't be there in person, to reconnect to Ain Shams, where I spent a very happy October and November. So this makes me very happy. And some of you may not know, but I thought there was a 2-hour time difference between London and Cairo, and just learned that in fact there's an hour time difference, which goes to show you can't always trust the web. Anyway, I will share my PowerPoint, and I have a feeling that you have already learned so much, at least in terms of my preliminary material, but I will go through it in any event. So let me get started here, and I will actually start at the beginning. And here is my introductory slide. So there's a fair amount of print, and if you want, I mean, you can take screenshots and so on. So anyway, here we are. The title, the first part of my title will be explained by the time we get to the end of the PowerPoint. So you will see where We Were Told of Disabilities comes from. So I think that you have been conferring now for a day, and this is a topic of interest to you, but I'm just getting us into the headset of what we think of when we think of disabilities. And I mean, just some of the sort of cliche or uppermost top of the mind things that come up are missing limbs that affect our mobility, such as quadriplegia, not being able to use arms and legs. And then secondly, impaired senses, particularly sight and hearing. And then and of course, we learned about what it's like not to use one's nose and one's sense of sense during COVID. And you realize how important that is, losing one's sense of taste as well. And we all know that chronic pain and disease certainly impede one's ability to function, along with addiction. And size. I mean, I've learned that in the US, the world is really designed for young men in their 20s who happen to be white. So even kitchens, I mean, are built not for women who are shorter, but for men who can reach higher. And looks are also a form of ability or disability, and we'll get into that. Like in the US, there's what's called a FATS right movement. And of course, the list has extended, and we know this just as teachers, to include issues that get in the way of learning, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which it seems many of my students have, and apparently increasingly so do we adults. There's adult onset attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, many kinds of learning disabilities, anxiety and depression, which can be so crippling. And if you're on the high end of the, or low functioning end of the autism spectrum, that gets in the way, along with personality disorders and even things like stuttering, which I'm proud to say our president, my current president of the US, has. So how do disability studies how do they connect? Whoops, sorry about that. Let me get into, oh goodness. Yeah, okay. How do disability studies factor into literary studies? Well, we know that literature should be, is about, or at least should be about, the lives that we all live. That is, literature should be inclusive. But disability, I don't know why this keeps moving. Disability, here, let me just shrink this. Disability is a part of many people's lives. We know that 15% of the world's population are said to be disabled in one way or the other. And now the we of the lives we all live include paying attention to the 15% who have been left out of the discussion. In the US, people with disabilities are one of the largest minority groups. Disability studies, in terms of literature, provides a framework, a perspective, and awareness. I'm so sorry, I'm trying to get these screens out of the way. For example, there are CRIP studies, and the word CRIP, I don't know how it's used in Egypt, but it's become a kind of form of pride. For example, like the word queer has become embraced by gay people, the LGBTQ community, to assert one's pride. And so CRIP means I am proud of who I am, I who am living with a disability. And we find that in terms of framework and perspective, that to those who study disability, it seems to be everywhere. So literary disability studies, and I'm going to keep going back to this point, examines both literature and the broader culture at large. And you have been studying disability in the last few days in Egypt and before this, but I just wanted to sort of see what the, how it's talked about, how it's approached in Egypt. And I see that there are three groups consisting of narrow disabilities, the largest of the three, middle, and then broad. And so if you can see this from the APS.AUC Egypt site, that the narrow refers to individuals who have at least some disability in one of the 6 functional realms: seeing, hearing, walking, cognition, self-care, and communication. And then the broad category means that individuals cannot perform in at least one of them. And in the middle, and again, I'm going to try to remove this bar, which, there we go, refers to individuals who find it difficult or impossible to form a function in any one of these 3. So let me get my PowerPoint. So for the rest of my presentation, I'll look at 6 broad categories. First, how did literary studies come to embrace, or how did it come to adopt literary disability studies, or extend to literary disability studies? Who are some of the leading theorists? What are some of the examples of literary, cultural, and cultural criticism done in disability studies? How do disability studies challenge the very idea of what is normal? What are critical disability studies? And then how do we work with disability studies in terms of approaching text? So starting with the history, and again, I have a feeling that you know this from the last few days that you have been hearing, that you've been present at the conference. But you know that Erving Goffman, in his book Stigma, started to talk about quote unquote abominations of the body, but he wants to emphasize that disability studies are socially formed and can vary by time and place. So that is really important, all right, socially formed. For example, in the US and in other countries, now there are requirements that all curbs have slopes so that you can move your baby's carriage, your wheelchair, your grocery cart easily from the street to the sidewalk. And so being wheeled about is no longer a form of disability because it's accommodated by the architecture. And so we need to be mindful of how, this kind of disability can vary. I mean, in the 19th century, ugliness was a form of disability. And to some extent, it is as well, but it's not codified into law. And then jump ahead from 1963 to 1976, Michel Foucault in The History of Sexuality writes about the way the state manages bodies. It sequesters them, it keeps them in rooms, it controls them, it diagnoses what disabilities and abilities are, it manages bodies. So he looks at the role of the state. Well, a few years later, Leslie Fiedler in Freaks talks about the way non-normative bodies were used as profit. So he positions these bodies in a capitalist framework. Well, now I'm jumping ahead 32 years to Disability Studies by Dan Goodley, where he talks about how disability is associated with discrimination and inequality. Jump ahead a few years to Tanya Tchaikovsky's Normal, where she looks at how ableism, that which stigmatizes disability, how it overlaps with racism, sexism, and other forms of human diminishment that, and again, I'm looking at my screen here, that positions some humans on the edge of belonging. So moving ahead, where did the disability movement come from? Well, in the US, it was built on the civil rights movements of the 1960s. So out of people legislating, getting into the streets, raising their voices, in the US, we have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the first disability civil rights law. And then the real law, the one that has become, so important, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I noticed that Egypt's Rehabilitation of Disabled Persons Act came about just around the same time as the US's Rehabilitation Act. And then the UN steps in 2008 and defines disability resulting from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So again, there's this emphasis on disability being the product of both social environment and the body. So that's the history. Here is a leading journal, Journal of Cultural and Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. 2007 seems to be a kind of watermark year. This is a British journal. And then I know Martha Stoddart Holmes. She actually was at the university where I first started teaching in the US, but her Fictions of Affliction has become a real foundational text. And her work is wonderful. Leonard J. Davis has written a lot as well, along with David Bolt, Elizabeth J. Donaldson, and Julia Amelia Rodas. And so Jane Eyre becomes one of those really important texts. And now when I teach it, I definitely use a disability studies approach. And then there have been special issues of journals in disability studies. For example, Cripistemologies, how do you see, how do you know as a result of being disabled? And again, you can see that taking the idea of being a crip and embracing that and claiming it and celebrating it. And then an issue of graphic medicine, graphic fiction, cryptographic medicine. And then there are some overlaps between disability studies and animal studies. And then this dancing journal on disability politics through the dancing body. So in this slide and in the next two, I just thought I would give you a kind of overview of the incredible amount of work. And this is just a selective, it's not even representative, but you can see that disability studies is now being done by critics around the world and in global literatures around the world, which is so kind of exciting. And so this is it's just a random sampling of some of the kinds of work that are being done. So if you read British literature, you know that Milton went blind, and he wrote his major works while he was blind. He dictated them to his long-suffering daughter, and I find that phenomenal. But here we have Benjamin Hiramatsu, Ireland's a Frenchman in Tokyo, Theology of Disability and Cultural Ableism. And notice this theology of disability, I mean, overlapping with religion and ableism, disability studies, as we can see by Angelo Murata's Doing Disability Movies Differently, looking at disability in film. And there's a lot on deafness and disability. You can see that in Rachel Kolb's piece on Mabel Bell. And then, interestingly, disability and white masculinization in science. And I'm just going to stop here and talk about disability and masculinity studies. If you think about masculinity, it's defined, especially white masculinity, it's defined as power, it's defined as being fully able-bodied, it's defined by the absolute opposite of weakness. And so when you combine masculinity studies and disability studies, you get so many of these really interesting overlaps. And so I think that a lot of work remains to be done there. And so I just kind of wanted to show my head and for a minute and talk about that. And so getting back to my sharing my screen here, let me get back to this. Oh, sorry about that. Let me unshare, stop sharing, go back to this slide here. Okay. Share. All right. And then stuttering, again, form of dementia or a form of disability. I think that, that's something to keep in mind, not being able to talk. I know that in the US, President Biden does get made fun of. And I mean, that's another thing, is being laughed at. And so disability studies is about how do we look at people without laughing at them or pitting them, but, bringing them into the full circle. And so more titles here, Shad al-Shamari's Literary and Cultural Depictions of Multiple Sclerosis in Kuwait, Marxism, Mediation and Disability Aesthetics by Hentai Yap, Deafness, Race and Labor, and Delia Steverson's Where's the Dummy, more of that intersectionality. And so you can see the list goes on. Ina Dimitrova, Bulgarian, looking at labor and deafness and work. Just the range of topics is so exciting. There's a lot on disability studies and wounded warriors, and I'll talk a little bit about disability studies and trauma studies. So anyway, these are just kind of a flavor of the kinds of work that's being done. But now I'd like to move into how disability studies challenges the very idea of what is normal. So again, important to keep in mind, and this is what we've been talking about already the last few days, disability is not just a medical problem located in an individual's body. So there's a refusal to accept the idea of medicalization. You need to look at it in the next bullet point as socially constructed. Look at the structures that name and identify disability. For example, look at how disability in some cultures, including my own, can sometimes be seen as a punishment from God. So understand the culture that defines the disability. And so that's why you can't unseparate or separate literary studies from cultural studies. And above all, and this is why I've highlighted this in red, disability studies works against the idea of normal and abnormal. It works away from stigmatizing. And you know that a stigma inspires fear, pity, and the image of the supercrip, you know, somebody who is disabled but can do more than anyone else, and moves us toward awareness, acceptance, and integration. And that's a quotation from Chrisman's, a reflection on inspiration. And addresses power differentials between the able-bodied and those with disabilities. And then finally, the emphasis on disability is that it's just another mode of human difference. Okay, moving along, critical disability studies critiques, you know, what it is. It's kind of activist, hence the critical. It's against hierarchy, and it addresses questions, for example, in the US, how do white disabled people get more attention than ethnic minorities? And in the US, ethnic typically is associated with Black, with Latino, Latina, Latine, minorities with disabilities. Why do wheelchair users receive more consideration than those with cognitive disabilities? And you see that even like I am not in favor of the many wars that my country fights, for example. I'm not in favor of what my country is doing in a country very close to yours at the moment. But a result of the many wars that my country fights is we have a lot of disabled soldiers who return with PTSD, and they don't get the kind of attention that soldiers who are missing limbs, who look visibly disabled, get. And so we see that discrepancy happening. And so I, wanted to bring our attention to that. And so I'll go back to share screen. There are debates on universality. For example, some people say that we are universally, temporarily able-bodied, that if we reach old age, if we're lucky enough, we won't be able-bodied. I mean, I'm just reading an article right now in the New Yorker, which is about how we've extended our lives, but what that means is now we're living longer being able-bodied. And so that's something to keep in mind. But then there are some who say that if we look at all of us as temporarily able-bodied, we may not be addressing those who experience lifelong discrimination. We might mute the effectiveness of their activism. So that's something to keep in mind. So these questions bring up other questions. Well, now I'd like to get to the final part of the presentation and look at how to work with disability studies in terms of approaching text. What kind of methodologies can we use? And I really like the way Leonard Davis, in Enforcing Normalcy, in his 1995 book, looks at the way the concept of normal arose in the industrial age. And he said that before the industrial age, the sort of criterion toward which people aspired was ideal. But with the industrial age, we wanted to kind of create a kind of sameness, like working on the production line, that led to greater efficiency. But then the idea of normal became associated with progress and eugenics. That is, how can we create babies who are all normal, who have no disabilities? So Davis looks at the way British novels feature ordinary, non-heroic citizens. And it's good to sort of feature on the non-heroic, but this idea of the normal goes on to marginalize characters with disabilities. They inhabit marginal roles. And so you can see, this progress of, what happened to the novel, at least in 19th century Britain. Then Rosemary Garland Thompson, in Extraordinary Bodies, looks in connection with Leonard Davis, looks at the way the normate, the normal, becomes this idealized position that has dominance and authority in society. And then when you're aware of that, you can look at how literary text contend with these ideas. In their book, Narrative Prosthesis on Moby Dick, David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder look at disability as a narrative device that reaffirms normalcy. So what these narratives do is they start with an explanation which inaugurates the narrative act. How did this disability come to be? And then that is followed by an account of the causes and the consequences of the disability, which then move on to restoring a sense of order. So the point is that those who are represented as having disabilities should not just be used as some prothesis, and we should be aware of that. And then as literary critics here, I see two things in the chat. Let me just make sure no one's talking to me here. Okay, no one. Okay, good. And then with an awareness of disability studies, we should be aware of the ideology of ability, which is sort of the baseline by which humanness is determined. Is humanness, determined by the very idea of ability. But with literary studies, there's this desire to move the margin to the center. All right. And then moving on to the next slide, here we have Otto Quayson in Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability, and the Crisis of Representation, looks at the 9 functions of disability in literary studies. So disability often is used as a literary device to reveal the morality of other characters. It overlaps, getting back to that idea of intersectionality, with racial, sexual, economic, and social otherness. We can see another function showing the disjuncture between the thematic trajectory and the narrative trajectory. And so again, these are just ways of, of going to a text, approaching it, and figuring out what you want to do with it. And they often, representations of ability and disability often are associated with moral deficit or evil. I think about, for example, Geoffrey Chaucer, who in his Canterbury Tales represents goodness as beauty and badness as ugliness and as deformity. Disability studies can offer tragic insight and then can lead us to normality. So anyway, you can go through that. And then I just want to give a nod to trauma studies, which do share a relationship with disability studies. Trauma studies often begin with stories of origination. How did the subject become traumatized? And then there are stories of explanation. How did this happen? There's an emphasis on disruptions between the past and the present, between the self and others, and you can imagine the role that memory plays. This is how I was then, this is how I am now. And the broken hero tends to become a very often featured narrative trope. And so as far as literary studies, what kind of text do we read? We could go back to canonical text and reread them, offer new kinds of readings, or we could go to texts that don't always make their way into the canon, like memoirs, people writing about their disabilities. For example, there's a famous essayist in the US named Leslie Jamison who writes about her time as an alcoholic, someone who lived with alcoholism, and how she's still, trying to live with this challenging disease. And then there are texts by authors with disabilities, whether they acknowledge them or not. And I bring up post-colonial texts because it's important to keep in mind. And then, texts by authors around the world to keep in mind that disability is socially formed and how the meanings change across cultures. And then I just thought I'd throw in some canonical texts from British and US literature in Jane Eyre. I don't want to give away the plot, but you'll see it matters when we get to the end of the novel. Why does our heroine decide to marry the hero? And there are very interesting reasons why, but it's such a beautiful book. I don't want to tell you what happens if you haven't read it yet. Anthony Trollope does a really powerful representation of alcoholism in his novel, Dr. Thorne. And I've been reading a lot of Émile Zola lately, where he has a number of characters with alcoholism. And you can see how this horrible condition, isn't just about the individual's experience, but the impact of that on the family. And so he is really good on the topic of alcoholism. And then there's E.M. Forster, who in his semi-autobiographical book, The Longest Journey, writes about frailty, and he writes about his own frailty. And then Juna Barnes, the Book of Repulsive Women, writes about ugliness at a time when looks really mattered in very significant ways. And Virginia Woolf, Jacob's Room, has characters with disabilities, missing fingers, an invalid. What roles do that they play? John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, very much foregrounds developmental disabilities, developmental delay. And Scott Momaday, Native American writer, Impaired Walking, Leslie Marmon Silko, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Anita Desai combines alcoholism with ageism, which is not exactly a form of disability, but is certainly related to it. And if you like humorous novels, you must read Death Sentence, which is about hearing. And then my main my main topic of study is Virginia Woolf, who does really interesting work on disability and ability. And if you want to kind of get a rundown of that, go to David Gallif's very short, fine essay called Disfigured Figures, Virginia Woolf's Disabled List. So I want to end with two poems, one by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Women Do Not Want It. This is from a longer poem. And she writes, we women, all right, she's a very woman-centered writer. She assumes that the audience are women. We were told of disabilities, and notice the passive voice here, a long array of these, all right? And so what are these disabilities? Till one would think that womanhood was merely a disease. So she's writing about how the very idea of being a woman is to be disabled. And if you think about womanhood in a patriarchy, women are never tall enough, they're never strong enough, they're never smart enough, they're never this enough, they're never that enough. And so, so she's writing this well over 100 years ago. And the maternal sacrifice was added to the plan of the various sacrifices we have always made to man. And notice the way man rhymes with plan. And so, you can see the sardonic, very sarcastic tone of this last rhyming couplet here. So I thought I would end with that poem, what have women had to say? And then I'd like to jump back several hundred years to Anne Bradstreet, a famous Puritan writer in the US, who, as you can tell from the title of her poem, the author to her book, she is writing to her book, the poet, as a disabled creature and as a disabled infant. So look at the connection she makes here. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runn'st more hobbling than is meet. And so we all know as writers that, you write, and then it's like you're introducing more defects. And notice how you take the language of ability and you apply it to writing. And then I rub off a spot and I make it worse. I stretch thy joints to make the even feet. And of course, you think of, feet in a verse of writing, and yet you're even more hobbled, more crippled than is appropriate. So you can see a writer's frustration here. I love this poem. So concluding thoughts, disability studies, wonderful, an exciting intellectual pursuit, and you can see the activist orientation built into them. And we see that literary disability studies should no longer be considered a narrow or specialized field. It's applicable to us all. It gets us to see that we humans vary a great deal physically and mentally. People should not be forced to conform to some sort of idealized human form that has come to be taken as the norm. We should think about embodiment, our bodies, in new ways. And COVID was a horrible thing. I know we're not still entirely out of it, but it did get us to think about physical disabilities and other kinds of inequalities, race, class, and we need to think about this more. So a bad thing, but it gets us to be more mindful and more aware. So that is the end of my presentation, and I wanted to leave enough time for questions. So please, ask questions, and I'm happy to talk about too how we contend with disability studies disabilities rather in my own university, if you'd like to, hear some stories about that and, what some of the policies and procedures there. And I'm willing to share anecdotes and stories and more about, what happens in the US, but I was giving you a kind of overview there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Dubino, for a very insightful talk about disability studies. I was really impressed by the wide range of disabilities included, actually, the different types of disabilities, the wide range of books and articles and journals dealing with that topic, the ideology of ability, and how you offered us this new insight into reading canonical texts, texts that we know with a new perspective. Thank you so much for this insightful talk. And now we are going to open the floor for questions. Here we have a question from one of the attendees.
From
Dr. Riham, she asks you, do you think that the illness identity model by Kathy Charmes be used in literary texts?
Thank you for that question. I am not very familiar with her work, but it sounds like I just went, and when I saw your question, I went and I Googled her. And so I guess that what I would like is if maybe you could, would it be all right if I called on you to explain how you think that that might work? Because I think that there are so many models and my presentation was so partial.
Okay, so Dr. Riham, can you tell us more about Kathy Charmes? Okay.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Why?
Hi. I am working on disability studies. I'm working on 3 memoirs, and I came across Sharma's work. She's usually concerned, she actually works on grounded theory, but this led her to do some studies on people who are with disability. And this was like, she had like real conversation with them until she came up with the model, illness identity model, and it helps her to understand how they lose themselves during the process of having an illness or a chronic disease or a disability. I'm actually still studying it, and I'm trying to implement that when I'm doing my memoir, working on my memoirs. So I was just like guessing, what do you think of it as a model, if you have any background about it?
Well, I think that those models that I put up there on how to kind of follow the narrative, like the before and the after and the process, and I think I would look at before, after, process. I would look at also centering and marginalizing, and then I would kind of frame it within the kind of larger social context. And I might play around with some of those different models that that I provide, that some other critics have provided. But I think that sounds really interesting, and I'm going to go check her out after this after we get off. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, and then
Thank you, Dr. Riham. And then we move to another question in the chat box. Professor, you have referred to masculinity studies and how researchers can relate them to disability studies. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think that Freud, I didn't realize that Freud saw women sick just because they're in possession of the womb. I think he sees them as kind of, I mean, of course, he was very complicated and he contradicted himself. And I believe that he did see women as full human beings. But on the other hand, he also saw them as lesser men, as not as developed as men. And he also imbibed some of the patriarchal ideas of his day as seeing them as only a part, as a section. And I think that that's part of disability studies too, is it gets you to see people not just as their disability, but as full human beings. Whereas what Freud did was he saw women as, you know, not as fully functioning human beings, but who function primarily as only walking wombs. And we can see that he was, again, ingesting the ideas of his day, because I think there is still a tendency to just see women as only mothers whose only capacity is to, you know, have children or carry children and then bear children and then nurture children. And so I think that, I think in a way that disability studies really ties in with undoing that kind of masculinist approach. And in some ways, disability studies is inherently feminist and really calling on the world to see women as fully functioning and not just in terms of one of their amazing body functions. I mean, I think that pregnancy is just a miracle in itself. I mean, this ability to bear life, but that's not only who women are. So you see, it takes us into these larger socioeconomic questions. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's a good question. I think, yeah, I think that Garland Thompson, and this is a question in the chat again from Professor Reham. I think that she is trying to, I think in a way she's suggesting that maybe we need to make feminism more inclusive and not just, you know, assume able-bodied people. And so all of these approaches like feminism need to be more intersectional. I know that one of the big problems with feminism when the second wave of feminism, that as it started in the 1970s, was it tended to be limited to white, straight, heterosexual women. And then as a movement, it expanded to women of color and women who were not just heterosexual, but, you know, women with abilities and all kinds of other, you know, other things associated with gender. So I might look at it like that. All right. And thank you for that question, Dr. Reham. And here's a question from Dr. Asma. How far can disability studies be read in light of queer theory? Well, I mean, I think about, for example, that when I'm just going to bring up transsexuality. So there's when an adolescent is in the US and in the West is said to be experiencing gender identity questions, that young person is said to experience gender dysmorphia. And I think of that word suggests that there's something dysfunctional and so on. And I wonder if the queer movement would like to kind of move away from that, because I think the queer movement is about undoing those dichotomies between us and them. And it's more about embracing the idea of of you know, all kinds of genders, all kinds of sexualities, and of, you know, enforcing the idea that our gender is a fluid thing. I mean, I don't know how much you're following of what's going on in the UK, and I follow it only in a very peripheral way, but in the US, there's a big sort of either or, like you're for trans people or you're not for them. And so there are a lot of laws that are being enacted to make it illegal to allow young people under 18 to go through gender hormone therapy or to go through any kind of surgery. And so this has many in the trans community up in arms, or those who are in favor. But what's happening in Britain and in other parts of Western Europe is there's this desire to kind of show that youth are going through all kinds of identity issues. You shouldn't pin them down to any one category until they've had a chance to kind of explore. Why should they be enthralled to the pharmaceutical or medical community until they know where they're at? And so I think that in some ways, like the gender queer movement has to kind of be careful about, say, pinning things down until, you know, especially with young people who are still sorting through their identity. So I don't know if, you know, that's an answer, but I do think that there's an emphasis in both disability studies, gender queer studies, not to kind of set up this exclusive, you know, inclusive, exclusive, or exclusive kind of framework that separates people into us and them, but to rather be inclusive and to realize the kind of flux that our identities and, you know, are constantly in. I don't know if that answers, but.
Okay. Stephanie, would you like to join us? Okay. So,
Go ahead.
any further questions?
Actually, can I ask you all a question? Our ability, I'll answer this question in case this is it.
Okay,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. Yeah. Do young people on college campuses, do they talk about depression a lot and anxiety? I mean, is that something that you as faculty, and maybe there are some students in the audience, that you are contending with in terms of, you know, working with disability in the classroom? I'm just curious.
Yes, actually, we have this kind of committee who actually deals with students with special needs, so that if any of the student has any complaint about maybe the way they study, they have difficulty in receiving the information or moving back and forth from their places to the faculty and so on and so forth, they are entitled to come and speak to the members of this committee. They are staff members, faculty members, and discuss their problems so that we can be the link between them and their professors in the classes, so that we can tell them that we have specific students who have certain disability, certain difficulties in dealing with special topic, so that all the faculty members will take care of this student with with actually her disability, so that we can come up with a solution, with ways to deal with this topic. So yes, we are really interested in stuff like this, and we actually document our endeavors in something like that.
That's great. Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that the US and Egypt kind of came up with their laws at about the same time. And so I wonder, you know, what other kind of parallels there are. I mean, our office, we have one office called accommodations. And so I think there's this desire to say, if you can accommodate people in their disabilities, then they can kind of enter the mainstream and function just like other students. So typically I will get letters about students saying, would you accommodate them in these ways, like give them more time on test, try to give them the notes ahead of time so that they can follow them. And then I have faculty, I mean, I know faculty who have students who have some degree of deafness and so on. And so you do see that also on college campuses. And I do find that, you know, having students with different abilities, it makes the classroom environment more interesting. Like we have a number of students now on the autism spectrum, and they provide a lot. I mean, you know, if somebody's disruptive, that's one thing, but I mean, it's interesting to have the different perspectives, and that makes the classroom experience a richer one too. And I think we all learn.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So when we talk specifically even about teaching literature, we are talking about how literature makes us better human beings. So part of being better human beings is the idea that we understand each other. We
yeah,
understand that this person has, like, for example, panic attacks. So if this student asks for permission to leave, okay, we totally understand something like that. So studying literature actually makes us understand this kind of situation or this special need embedded in a student. So again, we are linking our literature, studying literature with this kind of paying attention to people with special needs so that we can enlarge our space of empathy for every and each one. So that we
absolutely.
talk about, yes, characters and different works of art, and we say, okay, so this character deals with so and so, and we ask our students, can you relate to this character? Maybe a character that deals with an anxiety, a character that has special need. So I can see some students raising their hands and find that, okay, we suffer from stuff like that, and they relate themselves to the characters in specific works of art and say that, yes, we have been through this before. So it makes them feel that they are not alone.
Yes.
And yeah, we can share this. So the idea of speaking and the idea of expressing and the idea of getting it outside of them, it makes the situation much better than keeping it inside and just, you know, silencing their agonies, silencing their concerns. No, they have this space of sharing and talking, and this makes the situation much better.
And isn't literature just, I think you stated that so well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Really beautifully well. And I think that, you know, literature really plays another role. I mean, you just don't feel so alone. And so it's great to kind of choose text, especially that represent those with disabilities and these really, you know, positive ways. I think like Carson McCullers, oh my goodness, do my students like Carson McCullers? Yeah, yeah.
And since you have mentioned the post-colonial literature and sometimes the perspective of seeing, you know, the perspective of the colonizers, seeing the colonized in a specific way, when we come to discuss something like that, I can see that some of my students actually have this perspective of the colonizers, seeing maybe Black people as inferior. And then we come to discuss, no, this kind of dichotomy is incorrect. So you have to see from the other perspective. So disabling somebody for just the skin color is something that you have to think about and reconsider again. So we can find things like that in texts like Robinson Crusoe, for example, when he tries to deal with people of color in a specific way as slaves, for example, disabling them of their humanity and freedom. We can talk about this and being sensitive to stereotyping people or making them inferior or less in a way that is not fair. So we have to speak about it so that my students start to think, okay, we have the same perspective before, and now we are going to change it since we read it, since we studied it, since we talked about it.
That's really so beautiful. Thank you again. I think, again, there's nothing like literature to try to get students not to see that way. Like soon I'm going to be going to Brazil, where I just learned that Brazilians have something like 137 different categories for skin color, and Brazil is hierarchical. And so what does literature do with that? Well, I mean, who cares about the different shades of, you know, from
Yeah.
white to black? And literature gets, you know, Brazilians and us all to kind of not just look at skin in these very hierarchical kind of ways. And there's a question from Fatma Zogloff on the links between disability and ecofeminism and post-ecofeminism. For sure, I mean, ecofeminism looks at the way, you know, patriarchy exploits women's bodies, exploits the earth. And we think about the exploitation of bodies. And in fact, you can kind of see how patriarchy can kind of exploit bodies and make them sort of disabled. But I mean, I think that there's always this strong sense of social justice when you talk about disability studies, ecofeminism, feminism, and a real desire, you know, not just to look at the text, but go outside the text and say, oh, wow, that person has, you know, that, like in the US, we have a lot of street people. And if you can, you know, who do not have a home, a form of disability, and if you can look at street people as having their own being and lives, you wouldn't have, you know, people treating them as subhuman, which is what we do in the US. It's horrible. So you get into those other kinds of questions of economic social justice as well.
Yes, exactly. So now, my dear audience, do you have any further questions? Because we are coming to an end. It's almost 12 here in Egypt, Cairo local time.
Thank you. We appreciate everything. I'm Professor Niveen Sarwat from Alexandria University. And I wish you all the best. It was great. Thank you, professors.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. And again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have one last message that we can take. It's a thank you message for you, Professor Dubino. Thanks for such an enlightening session. And by that, we come to an end of our session today. Thank you, Professor Dubino, a lot for joining us in this in the conference and bringing to us this flood of knowledge about disability studies. I hope that we can take this very beautiful talk to further collaborations and discussions, texts from the West and East, and to start, you know, our research together. We can talk about texts in Arabic, for example, as you mentioned, memoirs written by disabled writers. For us, for example, we have Taha Hussein, for example, who is an author who lost his sight while child, but became one of the most important Egyptian intellectuals. We can, you know, speak about more authors and more writers. Thank you so much, Professor Dubino, for joining us, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.